Millionaire arrives early at ranch house and almost faints at the visual impact of what he sees. The headline could have read that way, but the reality was far more visceral. The sound of a child's laughter was like a gunshot to the chest for Santiago Navarrete. He stopped abruptly, his hands still on the door of his armored truck, a black steel monster that clashed violently with the dirt and straw road of the ranch. Santiago shouldn't have been there yet. His schedule, synchronized down to the second, indicated that there were 3 hours left until his scheduled arrival. But a canceled meeting in the city had pushed him back to this place that he both hated and loved in equal measure. He adjusted the knot of his Italian silk tie, feeling the dust in the air begin to settle on his immaculate leather shoes. Silence was the norm in his life. Since the accident, since the funeral, silence had been the only welcome inhabitant in his mansion. His 4 daughters, the quadruplets, who used to be a whirlwind of voices and shouts, had not uttered a single word in 6 months. Doctors called it post-traumatic selective mutism. Santiago called it the price of tragedy. But that sound was unmistakable. It was a laugh, not a shy giggle, but a loud, vibrant laugh, the kind that comes from the stomach and explodes uncontrollably. And it wasn't just one, there were several, blending together in a beautiful, out-of-tune chorus. Santiago felt a lump in his throat. His heart, usually a cold and precise clock, began to hammer against his ribs with a violence that frightened him. He closed the vehicle door too hard and walked towards the back of the property, guided by that noise he thought was extinct. He passed by the side of the empty stables, ignoring the musty smell of old wood, his gaze fixed on the main barn. What he saw as he turned the corner left him paralyzed, unable to take another step. The scene before him seemed to be from another world, or perhaps from a past life that he no longer remembered how to live. There in the middle of the corral, where the ground was damp and the chickens pecked nervously, was Valentina Corso, the new employee, the 23-year-old girl that the agency had sent with impeccable references for cleanliness and protocol. But the woman Santiago was looking at had no protocol whatsoever. Valentina was wearing her blue uniform, yes, but her white apron was stained with mud. She was wearing bright yellow rubber gloves that shone in the afternoon sun. And she was dancing. She didn't walk, she didn't clean, she didn't tidy up. She was kneeling on the ground, moving her arms as if they were wings, imitating the clumsy flapping of chickens, with her head thrown back and a smile so wide that it seemed to illuminate the place more than the sun itself. Around her was perfect chaos. His daughters, his 4 little heirs, Sophia, Elena, Lucia, and Martina. The same girls that morning he had left sitting at the breakfast table, rigid as porcelain dolls, dressed in immaculate pastel pink dresses with ribbons in their hair, perfectly styled. Now those designer dresses were unrecognizable. The pink had disappeared under layers of brown mud and dust. The ribbons hung undone. Their white socks were history, but they moved. Good heavens, how they moved. They ran in circles around Valentina, imitating her movements, raising their little arms to the sky, chasing the chickens that fled in terror between their legs. And the 4 of them laughed together, their mouths open, their eyes closed with joy, their cheeks flushed from the effort and the heat. One of them, Santiago thought it was Sophia, tripped over a root and fell face down in the mud. At any other time, that would have triggered hysterical crying, but not today. The girl stood up with a dirty face, looked at Valentina, and let out an even louder laugh, throwing a handful of dirt into the air as if it were confetti. Santiago felt the ground move beneath his feet. For months, he had hired the best psychologists in Mexico and Spain. He had bought the most expensive toys. He had decorated their rooms with the softest colors. He had shielded their surroundings so that nothing would disturb them. He had turned their life into a sterile and safe bubble, and nothing had worked. Silence continued to reign, and now this girl, this simple domestic servant, to whom he had barely spoken beyond giving her orders about the menu and the laundry, had achieved the impossible. She had done so by breaking each and every one of the rules he had imposed in that house. The dirt, the disorder, the risk. Santiago looked at his own clean, manicured, empty hands. Then he looked at Valentina's hands, gloved in dirty yellow plastic, but holding the attention and love of his daughters with an ease that physically hurt him. A toxic mix of emotions began to rise in his chest. Relief to see them happy, yes, but also a dark and dense fury. Fury because that happiness had been achieved at the cost of his authority. Fury because that scene represented everything he couldn't control. Fury because deep down he felt that that laughter did not belong to him. The wind blew gently, moving the leaves of the trees and bringing the smell of wet earth to his nose. Valentina turned around, oblivious to the boss's presence, and gently caught one of the hens, showing it to the girls. The four of them gathered around her, fascinated, touching the feathers with their stained fingers. It was an image of devastating tenderness. Santiago clenched his jaw until it hurt. His rational mind, the one that managed empires and closed million-dollar deals, regained control. He saw germs. He saw danger of infection. He saw ruined clothes. He saw blatant disobedience. He saw an employee who had forgotten her place. He couldn't allow it. If he gave in to chaos, the memory of the accident would return. Order was the only thing that kept him sane. Order was the only thing that kept those girls safe. Or so he told himself every night. He took a step forward, leaving the shadow of the barn and entering the light. His long, dark shadow fell across the happy group, cutting through the scene like a knife. But what on earth is going on here? His voice thundered, deep and authoritative, breaking the magical air of the afternoon like crystal striking the ground. The father's fury, the effect of his scream was immediate and devastating. It was as if someone had pressed an off switch in the universe. The laughter stopped abruptly, so suddenly that the echo seemed to hang orphaned in the air. The hens, frightened by Santiago's loud voice, flapped their wings frantically and scattered toward the henhouse. But what broke Valentina's heart, as she turned around abruptly with her eyes wide open, was the girls' reaction. The joy on their faces evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by absolute terror. The color disappeared from their cheeks. The smiles turned into grimaces of fear. Sophia, Elena, Lucia, and Martina did not run towards their father. They did not seek his protection. On the contrary, they instinctively retreated, stumbling among themselves and ran to hide behind Valentina's legs. They clung to the employee's blue uniform, staining it even more with their muddy little hands, burying their faces in the fabric of her apron, visibly trembling. Santiago was stunned. The image was a brutal blow to his ego and his fatherhood. His own daughters, his own flesh and blood, fled from him to seek refuge in servitude. That ignited a flame of cold anger in his eyes. He advanced with long strides, ignoring how the mud stuck to his Italian shoes, his eyes fixed on Valentina as if she were guilty of an unforgivable crime. "I asked you a question, Miss Corso," Santiago bellowed, stopping just a few feet away from her. His height and presence were intimidating, but Valentina, though trembling, didn't back down. She held her ground, her hands resting protectively on the heads of the girls hiding behind her. "What is this spectacle all about? Look at them. They look like animals wallowing in filth." Valentina swallowed hard. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. She knew who Santiago Navarrete was. She knew his reputation as a ruthless man, a man with a heart of ice. But she also felt the four girls' trembling little bodies pressed against her legs, and that gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Mr. Navarrete," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "We were just playing. They needed to play." "Play," he interrupted, pointing an accusing finger at the ruined dresses. "You call this playing? They're covered in bacteria. They're exposed to disease. Look, those dresses cost more than what I'll earn in my entire life, and I've destroyed it in one afternoon." "Clothes are washed, sir," Valentina replied, surprising herself with her audacity. She raised her chin slightly, meeting the millionaire's furious gaze. "Not sadness. They were laughing, sir. Didn't you hear them? They were laughing for the first time." Mentioning laughter was like rubbing salt in Santiago's wound. He hated that she was right, and he hated even more that an employee dared to give him parenting lessons. "Don't you dare talk to me about my daughters," he growled, lowering his voice to a dangerously soft tone that was more frightening than his screams. "You are here to clean, to keep things tidy, to take care of them according to my instructions. I gave you strict rules, no dirt, no risks, no leaving the safe zone of the garden. And what do I find? I find them in a chicken coop among animal droppings and mud. It is criminal irresponsibility. Santiago took a step further, invading Valentina's personal space. The girls let out a muffled moan, a collective sound of anguish that made Valentina tighten her grip on them. Get out of there, Santiago ordered the girls without looking at them, fixing his eyes on the employee. Come with me now. Nobody moved. The girls pressed themselves closer to Valentina. It was an act of silent rebellion that Santiago could not process. I said, come here, he shouted again, losing his composure. Martina, the youngest of the four, peeked shyly out from Valentina's side. Tears were streaming down the dirt on her face. She looked at her father, then at Valentina, and hid again, shaking her head. That rejection was the breaking point. Santiago felt something shatter inside him. It wasn't just anger, it was pain, a deep and ancient pain, but his defense mechanism transformed it into blind authority. He couldn't handle the emotional backlash, so he resorted to executive power. Enough, said Santiago, straightening up and adjusting his jacket with a jerky movement. You're fired. Valentina felt as if she had been slapped. What? She whispered. You heard me. I want you to pack your things and leave my property. Right now, I will not allow an irresponsible person to put my daughter's health and discipline at risk. Sir, please, Valentina pleaded, not for the job, but for the girls. She could feel them tense up, understanding the tone of farewell. Don't fire me. They need me. I'm not doing this out of malice. I'm doing it because they need to feel alive. They need to touch, to feel. They're children, not dolls. They're my daughters. Santiago cut her off implacably. And you're nothing here anymore. Security will escort you to the exit in 10 minutes. If I see you here when the sun comes up again, I'll call the police for trespassing. Santiago bent down and with a swift, firm movement, grabbed Sofia and Elena by the arms, pulling them from the refuge of Valentina's legs. The girls didn't scream. Their muteness prevented them from doing so, but their mouths opened in a silent, heart-wrenching cry, kicking in the air as their father lifted them up. No, don't hurt them! You scare them! Valentina exclaimed, instinctively taking a step forward, forgetting for a second that he was the owner and she was the employee. Santiago turned around with a little girl under each arm and gave her such an icy look that it froze her in place. Don't even think about taking another step, he warned. Stay away from them. Your influence ends here. Valentina stood there in the mud, her hands empty and her yellow gloves stained with dirt, watching as the richest man in the region led her daughters away like defective packages in need of repair. The other two girls, Lucia and Martina, ran after their father, crying silently, looking back at Valentina, reaching out to her as if she were their only lifeline in a stormy sea. Santiago didn't look back. He walked toward the mansion with a determined stride, dragging his family back to the sterility, silence, and solitude of his enormous, empty house. Valentina fell to her knees in the mud. The chickens, seeing that the danger had passed, began to approach again, pecking near her boots. But the magic was broken. The sun was beginning to set, and the evening chill seeped into her bones. I'm sorry, my girls. I'm so sorry, Valentina whispered to the wind as the tears began to flow down her face. Inside the house, the sound of a door slamming shut echoed like a final verdict. Silence had returned to Santiago Navarrete's life, but this time the price to pay would be far higher than he imagined. Immediate dismissal. Santiago's order was carried out in less than 2 minutes. The head of security, a burly man named Ramirez, who had worked for the Navarrete family for years and never questioned an order, appeared in the garden entrance with an impassive expression. Get her out of here, Ramirez, Santiago ordered, without even looking back, as he pushed the girls inside the mansion. And make sure she doesn't take anything that isn't hers. Valentina stood up with difficulty, wiping her mud-covered knees. The humiliation burned brighter than the afternoon sun. She didn't care about money. She didn't even care about being homeless that night. What broke her heart was seeing the solid mahogany doors of the main entrance close, swallowing up the 4 girls who just moments before had been laughing like never before. Ramirez approached somewhat uncomfortably. Even he, used to the boss's coldness, noticed that something was wrong in the air. "Miss Valentina, please," said the guard in a low voice, pointing towards the maid's quarters, which had a separate entrance on the side. "Don't make this harder. The man is very upset." "You can't do this to them, Ramirez," she said, her voice breaking, ignoring the instruction. "They were happy. Did you see them? My God, they were laughing. Those girls have been living dead inside that house for months, and today they became girls again." "I know, miss, but he's the father and he signs the checks. Come on." Valentina was escorted to her small room. She had 10 minutes, Santiago had said. 10 minutes to erase her existence from the lives of the quadruplets. With trembling hands, she pulled her old suitcase out from under the bed. She didn't have much: a pair of worn jeans, 2 t-shirts, a photo of her own mother, and the storybook she secretly read to the girls at night when Santiago thought they were already asleep. As she picked up the book, a sheet of paper fell to the floor. It was a drawing, a doodle made with wax crayons, where you could see 4 small figures dressed in pink and a taller figure dressed in blue, all under a giant, smiling sun. Below, in the shaky handwriting of someone learning to write, it said, "Mama." Valentina clutched the drawing to her chest and let out a muffled sob. She carefully tucked the paper into her clothes, as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. She zipped up the suitcase. The metallic sound of the lock echoed in the empty room, like the end of an era. When she went out to the backyard, escorted by Ramirez towards the main gate, something happened that stopped the hearts of everyone present. A sharp bang against the glass. Valentina turned around. On the second-floor window, the one that overlooked the playroom, there were 4 pairs of small hands pressed against the glass. They were the quadruplets. They had escaped the supervision of the other employees and were glued to the window. They couldn't scream. Their trauma prevented them from speaking, but their mouths were open in silent weeping, pounding on the glass with their fists, clouding it with their breath and tears. Santiago appeared behind them at the window a second later. His face was a mask of contained fury. Valentina watched as he pulled them away from the window, slamming the heavy velvet curtains shut with a violent movement, blocking the view, blocking the light, blocking the goodbye. "Walk, miss," Ramirez insisted, gently taking her arm, though his eyes showed pity. "If he goes downstairs and sees you still here, it will be worse." Valentina walked towards the wrought iron gate. Every step felt like a ton of weight. As she crossed the threshold onto the dusty road, the automatic gate began to close with a slow, steady electric hum. She stood there on the side of the road with her suitcase in her hand and her blue uniform still on, watching as the bars came together until they made a final metallic click. She was alone. The sky began to darken, foreshadowing the coming storm, not only in the weather but also inside that house, which now seemed like an impenetrable fortress. Valentina didn't leave. She couldn't. She walked a few meters towards a leafy tree at the edge of the property, sat on her suitcase, and decided to wait. She didn't know what to expect, but her instinct screamed at her that she couldn't abandon those girls that night. The silence that killed inside the mansion had made the atmosphere unbreathable. Santiago Navarrete had declared war on filth. Immediately after closing the curtains, he had taken the girls to the main bathrooms. He had fired the other employees who tried to help. He would take care of this himself. He needed to make sure that every trace of that disaster was eliminated. The bathroom was a cathedral of white marble and golden faucets. Santiago turned on the hot water, filling the bathtub with a mixture of imported soaps that smelled like a sterile strip. A clinical smell that had nothing to do with the swirl of wet earth and life that the girls carried on their skin. "Come in," he ordered, pointing to the water. The girls obeyed mechanically. Fear had returned them to their usual catatonic state. They allowed themselves to be undressed without resistance, like ragdolls. When Santiago began to run the sponge over their arms and legs, he did so forcefully, rubbing their skin until it was reddened, as if he wanted to erase not only the mud, but the memory of the afternoon. The water turned brown quickly. For Santiago, seeing that dirty water in his immaculate bathtub was confirmation that he was right. "Look at this," he muttered more to himself than to them as he rinsed Sophia's blonde hair. "Look at all this filth. How could she expose you to this? You are princesses. not farmers. You can get sick. You can get hurt. I take care of you. I'm the only one who truly takes care of you. The girls did not respond. They were sitting in the water with their knees drawn up to their chests, staring at him with big, empty eyes. There was no trace of the girls who had been chasing the chickens. The light in their eyes had completely gone out. Once they were clean, Santiago dressed them in identical white silk pajamas and brushed their hair until it shone in the candlelight. Perfect, he said, stepping back to admire his work. Order had been restored. Chaos had been defeated. They went down to dinner. The dining room featured a long, dark wooden table, so polished that it reflected the sad faces of the four sisters. Santiago sat at the head of the table, presiding with his usual rigidity. "Today, the chef prepared your favorite," Santiago announced in a forcedly animated tone, trying to break the wall of ice that had been built up between him and his daughters. Cream of asparagus and chicken breast in white sauce. The butler served the dishes in silence. The sound of fine china tapping on the table echoed like funeral bells in the huge empty room. Nobody moved. The four girls had their hands on their laps under the table. They stared at their steaming plates with no intention of lifting their utensils. "Come on, eat," Santiago insisted, cutting a piece of his own chicken. "It's delicious." Quiet. Only the sound of Santiago's cutlery scraping the plate and the ticking of the old clock on the wall filled the air. "Sophia, eat," he ordered, turning his gaze to the older girl. The girl didn't blink. She kept her gaze fixed on the green cream, absent-minded. "Elena, Lucia, Martina, take the spoon." Now nothing, not even a gesture. Not a defiant look, just absolute indifference. A total disconnection from reality. It was as if their bodies were there, clean and combed, but their souls had stayed outside in the henhouse with Valentina. Santiago felt frustration rising up his neck. He had done everything right. He had cleaned them, protected them, and given them the best food. Why were they punishing him like that? "I said eat," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Cutlery flew and a glass of water tipped over, spilling onto the pristine white tablecloth. The crash echoed through the living room, but the girls didn't even flinch. They didn't cry. They weren't frightened. They simply stared at their motionless plates. This lack of reaction was what shattered Santiago. If they had cried, it would have been something. If they had screamed, it would have been an interaction. But this silence was an abyss. He realized with growing horror that the cleaning had brought sadness back. He had washed away the mud, yes, but he had also washed away life. The house was spotless, again. There was no dust, no noise. Everything was in its place, and it felt colder than a grave. Santiago stood up abruptly, throwing his napkin onto the mess of spilled water. "Fine, if you don't want to eat, don't eat," he yelled at them, feeling powerless. "Go to your rooms right now." The girls slid from their chairs in unison, like tiny ghosts of white silk, and walked single file toward the stairs without once glancing at their father. Santiago remained alone in the immense dining room. The silence buzzed in his ears. He poured himself a glass of whiskey with slightly trembling hands and went to the window. Outside, the storm had begun. Lightning flashed across the garden intermittently, revealing the torrential rain. He peered into the darkness of the patio, toward where the afternoon scene had unfolded. For a second, he thought he saw something, a shadow beneath the tree near the gate, but he told himself it was impossible. Valentina would have left by now. No one would stay out in this rain. "It's for their own good," he whispered to the cold glass, trying to convince himself. "It's for their own good." But deep down in his heart, as the whiskey burned his throat, Santiago Navarrete knew that that night, in that perfect millionaire house, he was the poorest man in the world. And the silence, that silence he had so sought to preserve, was now slowly suffocating him. The discovery in the henhouse. The whiskey did nothing to calm the trembling in Santiago's hands, much less the deafening noise of his own thoughts. The house was silent, that neat and perfect silence he had demanded, but now he felt as if he were trapped inside a coffin. He looked at the wall clock. It was past 10 at night. The girls must have been asleep for hours, immersed in that chemical and dreamless sleep that seemed to be their only refuge since their mother's death. Santiago couldn't just sit still. The image of Valentina on her knees in the mud, with that broken but intact dignity, repeated itself in his mind like a scratched film. And above all, the laughter, that damned laughter of his daughters that wouldn't leave him alone. Why were they treating her like this? Why bond with a stranger who smelled of cheap soap and dirt and not with him, who gave them the whole world on a silver platter? He needed air. He felt like the walls of the mansion were closing in on him. He placed the cut crystal glass on the table with a thud and walked towards the back doors. When he opened them, the wind hit his face, wet and charged with static electricity. The storm that had been predicted all afternoon was about to break. The sky was a dark, turbulent mass that covered the moon, but it wasn't raining heavily yet, just a few fat, cold drops falling sporadically like warnings. Without really knowing why, his feet led him towards the place of the conflict, towards the henhouse. He walked along the stone path, ignoring that his leather-soled shoes were slipping in the wet conditions. He reached the wooden fence, now empty and dark. The hens slept on their perches, oblivious to the human drama that had occurred in their territory. Santiago leaned against the post, feeling the rough wood under his palms, and looked at the disturbed ground. You could still see the marks of his daughter's little boots in the mud, frantic circles tracing the choreography of their lost joy. Then something caught his attention, a flash of color in the gloom trapped between the planks of the fence, almost at ground level. It was an unnatural, garish yellow amidst the palette of browns and grays of the night countryside. Santiago bent down, ruining the perfect crease in his suit trousers, and pulled the object. They were Valentina's rubber gloves. She had left them behind in her haste, or perhaps they had fallen out when security dragged her outside. They were dirty with dirt, still damp. Santiago held them for a moment, feeling a strange pressure in his chest. They were common objects, cheap cleaning tools, but they had touched his daughters with more love that afternoon than his own hands had in months. Upon lifting the gloves, he discovered they were concealing something else. There was an old metal box, probably an old rusty biscuit tin, half buried in the dry straw next to the post. It looked like a secret hiding place. Curiosity overcame his pride. Santiago opened the metal lid, which groaned with a rusty squeak. Inside there were no jewels, no money, nothing of material value. There was a notebook, a simple spiral school notebook with a blue cardboard lid. Santiago took it out, feeling its light weight. He opened the first page under the dim light of the garden's security lamps. What he saw took his breath away. It wasn't the employee's notebook. It was a visual diary, a record. The first page had a title written in large, colorful letters made with crayons. The Magic Wings Club. Santiago turned the page. There were drawings, children's drawings, clumsy and wonderful strokes made by the hands of his daughters. He recognized Sophia's style, who always drew the sun-wearing sunglasses. He acknowledged Martina's energetic scribbles. But what struck him was not the technique, but the content. One drawing showed the four girls with wings painted on their backs flying over a green field. A large figure dressed in blue with yellow hair, Valentina, was holding their hands. Below, a note written in Valentina's round, clear handwriting read, "Day 4, today Sophia smiled because I told her that chickens are cousins of dinosaurs. Elena helped me look for eggs and wasn't afraid to get dirty. Fear goes away when your hands are busy creating." Santiago felt an icy chill run down his spine. He continued turning pages, devouring the content with desperate eagerness. Day 12, Lucia had a nightmare and didn't want to get out of bed. We made a fort out of sheets in the garden. I told her that the sun cures sadness. Finally, she fell asleep in my lap under the oak tree. Note, remember to bring more red crayons. Martina loves to paint flowers. Day 20, Mr. Santiago called today. The girls became tense. They hid under the table. It hurts me to see them like this. They think their dad is an ice giant. I have to teach them that ice melts too, even though he won't let me get close. Santiago paused at that phrase. Ice giant. A drawing accompanied the text. A tall, black, square figure with a face without a mouth and red eyes, standing far away from the girls. It was him. That's how his own daughter saw him, not as a protector, but as a distant and cold monster. Hot, angry tears stung Santiago's eyes. He had thought that his money protected them. He had thought that his severity kept them safe from the chaos of the world, But Valentina, in just 1 month, had understood what he refused to see. His daughters didn't need armored security. They needed life. They needed to get dirty. They needed to know that the world was not a sterile and dangerous place, but a place where chickens are dinosaurs and the sun heals pain. On the last page, there was a Polaroid photo stuck on with adhesive tape. It must have been from that same morning before he arrived. The four girls were looking at the camera with their faces smeared with jam, making funny faces. Valentina peeked out from around a corner, laughing. Santiago touched the photo. His daughters' faces were shining. There was no trace of trauma, nor of muteness, nor of the pain of being orphaned. In that photo, they were healed, and he had destroyed everything in 5 minutes of blind rage. He closed the notebook tightly, feeling guilt crush his heart like a hydraulic press. He had been wrong. He had been terribly wrong. He clutched the notebook to his chest next to the yellow gloves and looked up at the black sky. "What have I done?" he whispered to the wind. "My God, what have I done?" A raindrop fell on his cheek, mingling with a solitary tear, and then another and another. The sky suddenly opened, and the storm erupted in all its fury. The night crisis. The roar was apocalyptic. Thunder shook the earth beneath Santiago's feet, so loud it rattled his teeth. The sky lit up with a blinding white flash that turned night into day for a second, revealing the ghostly silhouette of trees whipping violently in the wind. The rain began to fall like a solid curtain, soaking him in seconds, ruining his $1,000 suit, making his shirt stick to his skin. But Santiago no longer cared about clothes. An irrational, primal fear gripped him. He ran toward the house, protecting the notebook under his soaked jacket. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the mansion as if it wanted to get in. When he reached the back door, soaked and panting, the house lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went out. The darkness was total. The mansion, always illuminated like a beacon of security, became an immense and menacing wolf's mouth. Only the lightning that streamed through the windows offered brief flashes of strobe light, creating long, twisting shadows that danced through the hallways. "Ramirez, start the generator," Santiago shouted, his voice echoing in the empty foyer. But there was no response. The intercom was dead. The paternal instinct, the one he thought he had buried under layers of logic and efficiency, went off like a fire alarm in his brain. The girls hated thunderstorms. The night their mother died, there had been a similar storm. They must be terrified. Santiago took the stairs 2 at a time, guided by muscle memory and the flashes of lightning. His breathing was ragged, raspy. "Sophia, Elena," he shouted, his voice full of panic. "Dad's coming. Don't be afraid." He arrived at the second-floor hallway. The door to the girls' room was closed. Santiago turned the doorknob with hands slippery from the rain and sweat. He stumbled in. "I'm here now, don't worry." He expected to find crying. He expected to find them huddled under the sheets, trembling or hiding in the closet. He expected to have to comfort them, but all he found was the sound of the wind hitting an open window. A flash of lightning illuminated the room with a cruel clarity. The 4 four-poster beds, with their Egyptian linen sheets and pink bedspreads, were empty. The pillows were unused. The stuffed animals were perfectly aligned on the shelves, silent witnesses to the absence. Santiago felt his blood run cold in his veins. "Girls," he whispered, his voice breaking. He entered the room, desperately searching, and looked under the beds. Nothing. He opened the giant wardrobe. It was just hanging at clothes. He ran to the empty adjoining bathroom. "Girls!" I shouted down. A heart-rending scream came from within him. He approached the open window. The curtains flew horizontally due to the force of the gale, letting in the rain that was already forming puddles on the hardwood floor. Santiago looked out, ignoring the water hitting his face. He looked down. Just below the window was a thick vine that grew down to the side garden. And there, caught in one of the thorny branches, waving frantically in the wind like a flag of surrender, was a piece of cloth, a piece of white silk, a piece of pajamas. Reality hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. They had not hidden inside the house. They weren't playing hide and seek. They had escaped. His daughters, his little 4-year-olds, who had never gone out alone or even into the hallway, had escaped in the middle of the worst storm of the year, And Santiago knew exactly where they were going or who they were looking for. They weren't running from the storm, they were running from him. They were going to look for the only person who had made them feel safe. Valentina. Santiago turned away from the window, pale as a corpse. The clock in his mind began to tick at a dizzying speed. The ranch was enormous. Hectares of wild land, streams swollen with the rain, animals, wells, farm machinery, and outside the ranch, the state highway, where trucks sped past, unable to see anything in the downpour. It was 10:30 at night. It was dark. It was raining cats and dogs, and his daughters, mute, defenseless, and dressed only in silk pajamas, were out there alone in hell. Santiago ran out of the room, slipping in the hallway, going down the stairs in suicidal desperation. "Ramirez, everyone!" he roared as he ran towards the front door, his voice competing with the thunder. "Come out now, my daughters. They're not here." He threw open the front door and plunged into the black night, without a flashlight, without a raincoat, without thinking. The businessman had disappeared. The millionaire obsessed with cleanliness had died. Now there was only a terrified father left, willing to destroy the world with his own hands, if necessary, to find his daughters before the darkness swallowed them forever. The desperate search. The exterior of the mansion had been transformed into a war zone. The wind howled with a violence that Santiago had never witnessed from the safety of his air-conditioned offices. The rain didn't fall. It struck horizontally, like thousands of ice needles piercing his exposed skin. In a matter of seconds, his Italian linen shirt clung to his chest, transparent and soaked, and his leather-soled shoes, designed for boardroom carpets, became useless skates on the swamp-turned lawn. "Sophia! Elena!" shouted Santiago, shielding his eyes with one hand, spinning in circles in the darkness. His voice was instantly swallowed by the roar of thunder that shook the foundations of the house behind him. There was no response. Of course there wasn't one. His daughters couldn't answer. They were mute. That reality, which for months had been a clinical nuisance or a source of silent sadness, now revealed itself as a death sentence. If they were injured, if they were trapped, they couldn't scream for help. They were invisible ghosts in the middle of the storm. Santiago ran towards the main road, slipping and falling to his knees. The impact was brutal. He felt like a sharp stone was tearing through the fabric of his pants and cutting the skin of his knee, but the physical pain was irrelevant. He got up, spitting mud, with his hands black with dirt, and kept running. "Lucia! Martina!" he roared again, his throat burning. The headlights of a security vehicle flashed in the distance, sweeping the rain with beams of white light, but they were searching the wrong perimeter, near the stables. Santiago knew, with a visceral certainty that made his stomach churn, that they had not gone to the horses. He looked down at the ground in despair, searching for any sign. The mud, that same mud that hours before had seemed repugnant and unacceptable on his daughter's dresses, was now his only hope. And there he saw it. Under the intermittent glow of lightning, he saw a footprint. It was small, tiny, barely a crack in the soft earth that the water was about to wash away. And 1 meter further on, another and another. A pathetic and hesitant trail of small feet, some barefoot, others with socks that were dissolving in the mud. The trail didn't lead towards the house. It didn't lead towards the barn. It led south, towards the exit, towards the road. Santiago's heart stopped for a moment. The state highway was less than 120. It was a fast road, full of cargo trucks crossing the night with no visibility, driven by tired men who would never see 4 little girls crossing the asphalt in the torrential rain. "No, no, no," Santiago gasped, forcing his legs to move faster. He understood his daughter's plan with devastating clarity. They were not running away aimlessly. They had a destiny. They were going to look for Valentina. They had seen her leave through the main gate and, in their childish and desperate logic, they thought that if they walked far enough in that direction, they would find her. They were heading towards danger because he, their own father, had expelled their only source of security. Santiago ran like a madman. He was short of breath. His lungs burned as if he had swallowed fire. Each step was a struggle against the mud that tried to suck in his shoes, slow him down, trap him. "Damn it," he shouted, tripping over a root and falling flat on his face for the second time. This time his face sank into the mud. The metallic taste of earth and blood filled his mouth. He lay there for a second, lying on the ground, humiliated, defeated, covered in the same dirt he so despised. His money, his Swiss bank accounts, his stocks, his lawyers. None of that mattered here. He was a rich man who couldn't buy his daughter's safety. He was a powerful man who could not stop the rain. He got up with an animalistic growl, wiping his eyes with his dirty sleeves. Santiago Navarrete was no longer the tycoon. He was just a terrified father fighting against the elements. That's when he saw something that chilled his blood more than the cold rain. The trail of footprints veered off course. They were not going towards the main gate. In the darkness and confusion, the girls had become disoriented. Their footprints turned to the left, moving away from the gravel road and into the undergrowth towards the slope that led down to the western boundary of the property, towards the Coyote Creek, a stream that in summer was a harmless trickle of water where the servants drank. But Santiago knew, because the foreman had warned him in the reports he barely read, that when it rained like that, that stream became a death trap, a fast, violent, and deep current capable of sweeping away cattle, trees, and small girls. "No!" The scream came out of his throat, raw and rough. "Not that way!" Santiago changed direction, launching himself through the thorny bushes that tore at his suit and skin. He didn't feel the cuts. He only heard a sound, a dull, constant roar that grew above the wind, the sound of water running furiously. Fear turned into pure panic. He imagined the small bodies of Sofia, Elena, Lucia, and Martina being dragged by the black water, spinning in the current, unable to scream, unable to breathe. "Hold on," he pleaded with the void. "Dad's coming! Dad's coming!" He ran blindly, bumping into low branches and jumping over fallen logs. The terrain sloped sharply downwards. His feet slipped in the clay mud, and he began to slide uncontrollably, going down the slope backwards, trying to stop, digging his fingers into the ground, breaking his nails, desperate not to fall into the void, which he knew was close. He stopped when he violently crashed into the trunk of an old tree. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him dizzy for a second. From there, clinging to the tree, he looked down. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and Santiago saw his worst nightmare come true. The stream had overflowed. What was once dry land was now a torrent of chocolate-colored water that roared powerfully, dragging branches and debris along with it. And there, on a small island of land that the water was rapidly devouring, trapped between the current and a mud wall impossible for them to climb, were the four of them. They huddled together, forming a small ball of mud-stained white pajamas, trembling violently as the water licked at their bare ankles. They were alive, but the water was rising quickly. "Girls!" Santiago's scream was so loud that it seemed to stop the rain for a moment. The four little blonde heads turned upwards, towards where he was at the top of the embankment. Their faces were pale, almost blue, from the cold, illuminated eerily by the lightning. Upon seeing their father, there was no relief in their eyes, only paralyzing terror. Elena pointed to the rising water, opening her mouth in a silent cry for help. Santiago assessed the situation in a millisecond. They were about 5 meters below. The slope was a deadly mudslide. If he went down carelessly, he could fall on them, or worse, slip directly into the water and be swept away, leaving them alone. But there was no time to look for ropes or to call Ramirez. The water was rising centimeters per second. "I'm going down," he shouted, trying to sound confident, even though he was terrified. "Don't move. Hold on tight." Santiago took off his soaked jacket and threw it aside. He loosened his tie and began to descend, digging his heels into the mud, grabbing onto exposed roots. It was a disaster. He had barely descended 2 meters when the ground gave way under his weight. Santiago lost his balance. His feet flew upwards, and his body hit the hard mud, sliding violently downwards, straight into the turbulent water, just a few meters from where the girls were. "Ah!" he screamed as he tried to stop, his hands scratching uselessly at the liquid mud. He managed to stop at the last second, desperately clinging to an outcropping rock, his legs already dangling over the roaring water. The cold of the stream instantly numbed his feet. He was stuck. If the current broke, it would carry him away. and he was on the opposite side of the small island where his daughters were. They were caught in the middle. He was hanging off the shore. He couldn't reach them. His arms weren't long enough. Then he heard a muffled groan. It was the first time he had ever heard a voice. It was Martina. Terror had made her break her silence. That sound shattered him. There he was, 3 meters away from them, the most powerful man in the country, and he couldn't save them. "Give me your hand," he shouted, stretching out his right arm while clinging to the rock with his left. His fingers were trembling. "Give it a try." The girls stretched, but they were too far away. The water began to cover the islet. Sophia slipped and fell into the water up to her waist. The other 3 grabbed her shirt, pulling her back with all their might, crying silently. "No!" Santiago screamed, feeling the most absolute helplessness of his life. He was going to see them die. He was going to watch them drown before his eyes. He closed his eyes for a second, praying to a God he hadn't thought about in years. And then it happened. From the darkness on the other side of the stream, where the slope was less steep but just as dangerous because of the undergrowth, a figure emerged. It wasn't a security guard. It wasn't a firefighter. It was a quick, agile shadow, moving with fierce determination. Valentina hadn't left. She hadn't taken the bus. She had stayed camped outside the walls in the rain, sensing the disaster, listening to the screams that the wind brought, and she had arrived before anyone else. "Valentina!" Santiago shouted with a mixture of shock and infinite hope. She didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the girls. Her street clothes were soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, but she moved with a confidence that Santiago envied. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to assess risks. Valentina jumped. It was a leap of faith. She jumped from the firm shore towards the muddy islet where the girls were. She landed heavily in the mud, slipping and falling to his knees right in the middle of the group. "Mom!" The girls threw themselves at her instantly, clinging to her body like limpets. Valentina hugged all 4 of them at once, shielding them with her own body against the wind and rain. She looked up at Santiago, who was still hanging precariously from the rock on the other side. Their eyes met over the roaring water. In Valentina's eyes, there was no reproach, no hatred for being fired, no fear for her own life. There was only steely determination and a clear message. "We work together, or you die." "Sir," she shouted, her firm voice cutting through the storm, "I can't get you out on my side. The slope is too steep. I have to get you over." Santiago understood. He had to be the anchor. He had to climb back to solid ground and pull them out one by one. "But I can't climb up," he cried desperately, feeling his fingers slip off the rock. "It's very slippery." Valentina looked around. She saw a long, thick branch that the current had stuck near the islet. She pulled it out of the mud with an effort that tensed every muscle in her neck. "Grab this," she shouted, extending the branch over the water toward him. Santiago let go of one hand from the rock and in an agonizing movement caught the end of the branch. "Now pull," the maid ordered the millionaire. "I'll provide a counterbalance. Get in." It was madness. Valentina, a petite woman, was using her own body and the weight of the 4 girls anchored to her to support the large man as he climbed through the mud. Santiago grunted, using every ounce of strength he had left, digging his knees in, pulling on the branch Valentina held as if it were the sword of Excalibur. He managed to climb up. Panting, he crawled to safe ground on his shore. "Ready," he shouted, turning towards the water. He was in position. He was safe, but they weren't. "Grab her," Valentina shouted. She lifted Martina, the youngest, into her arms. She approached the edge of the islet where the water was already up to her calves and threatened to sweep her away. "Jump, my love, jump into Daddy's arms," Valentina shouted to the little girl. "He's going to get you. I promise you he's going to get you." Martina looked at Santiago. He stretched out his arms, opening them wider than ever before, not only physically, but emotionally. His face was covered in mud, his eyes red from crying and rain. "Come here, Martina, I've got you," Santiago swore. "I swear on my life I've got you." Valentina threw the girl. It was a short flight over the black water. Santiago lunged forward, catching the small body in midair, pressing her to his chest with desperate strength. He felt his daughter's heart pounding like a frightened bird against his own. "I've got her," he shouted, setting her down safely on the ground behind him. Next, one by one, Lucia, Elena, Sophia. Valentina lifted them up, gave them courage, and threw them into the arms of a father who, for the first time, was there to receive them. Dirty, broken, but present. When Santiago caught Sophia, the last of the girls, the water level rose suddenly. A large log came tumbling down the current and slammed into the islet. The earth gave way. "Valentina!" The four girls and Santiago cried in unison. The islet crumbled. Valentina lost her balance. She didn't have time to jump. The water slammed against her legs with the force of a truck and swept her away. Santiago watched in horror as the current carried off the woman who had just saved his family. She didn't scream. She only raised a hand trying to grab onto something as the dark water engulfed her and dragged her downstream into the total darkness of the night. "No," Santiago stood up, leaving the girl safe under the tree, and ran along the bank, following Valentina's head as it appeared and disappeared in the water. "I won't leave you." The millionaire threw himself into the water, without thinking, without calculating. He plunged into the swollen stream, swimming with suicidal fury toward the woman he had fired minutes before for being dirty. Now she was the only clean and pure thing in his world, and he wasn't going to let her die. The rescue of the maid, the thermal shock was brutal. The water wasn't just cold, it was freezing. A liquid mass on the verge of freezing hit Santiago's body like a concrete wall, knocking all the air from his lungs in an agonizing instant. The current grabbed him immediately, powerful and merciless, making him spin around like a rag doll. There was no up or down, only darkness, noise, and the suffocating sensation of dirty water entering his nose and mouth. Santiago kicked with frenzy, fighting against the weight of his own soaked shoes and pants. His survival instinct screamed for him to reach the shore, to save himself, but an image shone in his mind with the intensity of a lighthouse in a storm. Valentina's hand disappearing beneath the surface. "Valentina!" he tried to scream, but only swallowed murky water. She surfaced, coughing, spitting out mud. A flash of lightning illuminated the streambed, and he saw her. She was about 10 meters ahead of him, struggling to keep her head above water, but visibly exhausted. The impact with the log had left her stunned. The current was pulling her straight toward a bend in the stream, where the water crashed violently against a wall of sharp rocks. If she reached it, the impact would kill her. Santiago swam. He swam like he never had in the heated pools at his private clubs. He swam with rage, with desperation, ignoring the pain in his muscles and the blows of submerged branches that bruised his ribs. "Hold on!" he roared mentally, stroking with a strength born of the absolute terror of having another death on his conscience. Valentina sank again. Santiago pushed himself up, stretching out his arm until he felt his shoulder dislocate. His fingers brushed against the fabric. They closed in on her. It was the collar of the uniform. He pulled back violently, pulling her head out of the water. She coughed a hoarse, desperate sound and clung to his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide and with the one maze, but when she saw Santiago, something in her gaze changed. It wasn't relief, it was surprise. The millionaire was there in hell with her. "I have to get you out," Santiago shouted into her ear over the roar of the water. But the stream wasn't going to relinquish its hold so easily. A whirlpool caught them, spinning them around together. Santiago hit his back against a submerged rock, a sharp pain shooting up his spine. But he didn't let go of Valentina. He hugged her with one arm to his chest, using the other to try to grab onto something, anything. "Sir?" Valentina cried, pointing ahead. A giant root from a fallen tree jutted out of the muddy bank a few feet away. It was their only chance before the rocky rapids. "Come on!" he shouted. She kicked with all her might, propelling both of their weights toward the bank. The water felt like tons. Her legs felt like lead. They were a meter, half a meter away. Santiago threw down his free arm. His fingers slipped on the wet wood of the root. "No!" he shouted. He tried again, digging his nails into the bark, tearing his skin, and this time he clung on. The pull of the current was brutal, stretching his body as if it wanted to tear him in two, but he held on. He had Valentina with his left arm and life with his right. "Get up," he ordered her, pushing her upward. "Use my body. Get up." Valentina tried to climb, but she was too weak. The cold had paralyzed her. It was then that the beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness and hit them in the face, blinding them. "Sir!" It was Ramirez's voice. The head of security and two other guards were on the bank, sliding through the mud with ropes in their hands. They had followed the trail. They had raced against time. "Throw the rope!" Santiago bellowed, feeling his fingers begin to give way on the root. A heavy rope fell into the water beside them. Santiago caught it with his teeth first, then let go of the root for a split second to loop it around Valentina's waist. "Ah," he yelled to her. "No, you first," she retorted, coughing up water. "Do as I say, damn it," he yelled at her with a ferocity that brooked no argument, tying the knot himself with clumsy, frozen hands. Pull her out!" The guards pulled. Santiago watched as Valentina was dragged out of his reach, hurtling through the water toward the safe bank. Only when he saw Ramirez grab her arms and pull her safely into the mud did Santiago allow himself to feel the exhaustion. "Now the Lord!" he heard Ramirez shout. The rope dropped again. Santiago grabbed it, but he had no strength left. His hands wouldn't respond. The cold had seeped into his bones. The rope slipped from his grasp. Santiago heard a shout. It wasn't Ramirez. He looked up from the water. Valentina, soaked and shivering, had broken free from the guards and was back at the edge of the abyss, the rope in her hand, pulling it along with her. "The men have the rope! Don't let go!" she shouted, crying. "For your daughters! Don't let go!" The mention of his daughters was the final adrenaline rush. Santiago clenched his fists around the rope, growling like a wounded animal, and let himself be dragged against the current, slamming against the mud, rising inch by inch until he felt solid ground beneath his chest. He collapsed in the mud, gasping, vomiting water, his heart pounding in his ears like a war drum. He was alive, but there was no time to rest. "Papa! Mama V!" 4 small figures rushed toward them. The girls who had been waiting under the tree, protected by fear, ran toward the group as soon as they saw them emerge. They didn't care about the mud, the blood, or the cold. They threw themselves on top of Santiago and Valentina, forming a human mountain of tears and hugs. Santiago felt Sofia's slender arms around his neck. He felt Martina's head resting on his chest and saw Elena and Lucia hug Valentina, kissing her filthy hands, checking her face with trembling fingers to make sure she was unharmed. The millionaire struggled to his feet, sitting in the mud. He looked around. They were all covered in filth. His suit was ruined. His dignity was shattered. Ramirez and the guards shone their flashlights on them, respectful but visibly shaken. Santiago looked at Valentina. She sat across from him, knees drawn up to her chest, shivering violently, her lips split and blood on her forehead. But she didn't complain. She held 2 of the girls in her lap and rubbed their backs to warm them. Their eyes met in the rain that was beginning to ease. In that moment, amidst the mud and darkness, Santiago Navarrete understood that he had been blind his entire life. Money hadn't saved his daughters that night. Protocol hadn't protected them. What had saved them was the courage of a woman he had despised and the dirty, messy, real love he had tried to banish. "Let's go home," Santiago said, his voice hoarse and broken. He didn't get up alone. He reached out to Valentina. She looked at him, hesitating for a second. Then she reached out her mud-gloved hand and took his. Santiago pulled her gently, helping her to her feet, and together, surrounded by the 4 girls who didn't want to let go, they started walking toward the mansion. The head of security stepped forward to offer his jacket to the boss. Santiago shook his head and instead took Ramirez's raincoat and put it over Valentina's shoulders. "She needs it more," Santiago said, and continued walking in the rain, holding his youngest daughter's hand, leaving behind the man he used to be, the surrender of the millionaire. The mansion was strangely warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The emergency generator had kicked in, bathing the house in a soft, quiet amber light. In the main room, in front of the giant stone fireplace, where the fire was already crackling loudly, the scene was picture perfect. Renaissance in style, but painted with mud and pain. No one had gone to their rooms. No one had obeyed the rules of cleaning themselves before entering. They were there on the priceless Persian rugs. Santiago, Valentina, and the 4 girls, wrapped in thick wool blankets, drinking cups of hot chocolate that the other servants had brought running, with tears in their eyes at the state they had returned in. The family doctor, Dr. Arriaga, was finishing examining Valentina. He put a small bandage on her forehead and checked her ribs. "She'll be fine, Mr. Navarrete," the doctor said, putting away his stethoscope. "Only bruises and severe exhaustion. Requires rest, lots of rest, and warmth." "Thank you, doctor," Santiago murmured. He was standing by the mantelpiece, still wearing his wet clothes, which he had changed into a dry tracksuit, but with his hair disheveled and his gaze lost in the fire. He couldn't stop looking. He watched as Valentina, despite the doctor's order to rest, sat on the floor, not on the sofa. The four girls were surrounding her, forming a closed and impenetrable circle. Sophia was brushing Valentina's wet hair with touching gentleness. Elena held a cup of chocolate for her to drink. Lucia and Martina were lying against her legs, half asleep, clinging to Valentina's blanket as if it were their lifeline. Santiago observed the scene and felt a pang of jealousy, but it wasn't the possessive jealousy of before. It was envy, healthy and painful envy. They loved her. They loved her in an instinctive and fierce way that he had failed to inspire in years of expensive gifts and perfect discipline. He realized that he was the stranger in that room. He was the intruder in his own family. Valentina looked up and caught him staring at her. She tried to get up, a conditioned reflex from her position as an employee. "Sir, I'm sorry about the rug," she began, her voice rasping. "I know it's silk and mud." "Shut up!" Santiago interrupted. But there was no anger in his voice. It was a soft whisper, almost a plea. Santiago moved away from the fireplace and walked toward them. The girls visibly tensed as he approached, protecting Valentina with their small bodies, like a barrier of puppies defending their mother. That gesture, that instinctive fear that he would hurt them again or separate them from her, finally broke Santiago's heart. He stopped in front of them. Then he did something that left everyone in the room, the doctor, the maids watching from the doorway, and Valentina herself breathless. Santiago Navarrete, the man who never bowed down, the man who looked down on everyone, bent his knees and knelt on the rug at their level. He didn't care about the pain in his injured knee. He lowered his head, looking at his own clasped hands, unable to hold Valentina's gaze, which was clear and honest. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out strangled, small. The silence in the room became absolute. Only the crackling of the firewood could be heard. "Forgive me," he repeated, raising his eyes, his gaze filled with tears he no longer tried to hide. "I was stupid. I was blind. I almost killed you today. I almost killed you all because of my pride, because of my damned obsession with order." He looked at his daughters one by one. "I thought that if everything was clean, the pain would go away. I thought that if we didn't talk about Mom, the sadness would disappear. But I only managed to make you disappear too." Then he turned his face to Valentina. She was looking at him with wide eyes, the cup of hot chocolate trembling in her hands. "Valentina, Mom," he said, using her name for the first time without a tone of command or contempt. "You saw what I didn't want to see. You gave them what I couldn't give them. I threw you out like a dog. I humiliated you, and yet you jumped into that river for them. You risked your life for the daughters of the man who despised you." Santiago took a deep breath, feeling the lump in his throat loosen. "I'm not going to ask you to stay on as a servant," he said, shaking his head. "That would be an insult after tonight. But I beg you, I implore you, do not leave. My daughters need you, and you know I need to learn to be the father you are as a mother, even though you're not one." He held out his hands, palms up, in a gesture of total surrender. "Please teach me. Teach me not to be afraid to get my hands dirty." Valentina set her cup on the floor. She looked at the powerful man, reduced to a vulnerable human being before her. She saw genuine regret in his gray eyes. She saw the terror that still lingered in him at how close he had come to losing everything. She didn't respond with words. Slowly, Valentina pulled a hand from under the blanket. It was covered in scratches, broken and dirty nails, and she placed it in Santiago's hands, squeezing them warmly. That contact was the signal. Sophia, the eldest, stirred, pulled away from Valentina, and took a hesitant step toward her father. Santiago looked at her, holding his breath. The little girl raised her hand and touched her father's cheek, wiping away a tear that was falling. And then the miracle happened. Papa, Sophia whispered. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, weak as a wisp of smoke. But it was there. She had spoken. Santiago let out a sob that shook his entire body, closed his eyes, and rested his forehead on his youngest daughter's shoulder, weeping openly, releasing years of pent-up grief. The other three girls joined the embrace, surrounding their father and Valentina, creating a knot of bodies and souls that healed each other in the warmth of the fire. That night in the Navarrete mansion, no one slept in their perfect beds. They slept there on the carpet. From the living room, they were huddled on makeshift mattresses, Santiago at one end and Valentina at the other, watching over the four girls who slept peacefully in the middle. Order had been shattered forever, and there had never been such peace in that house. Valentina's revelation. Dawn arrived with an unreal calm, bathing the living room in a golden light that filtered through the heavy curtains someone had had the decency to open during the night. The fire in the fireplace had dwindled to glowing red embers, emitting a soft, steady warmth. Santiago woke with his neck stiff against the sofa. For a moment, as he opened his eyes, he didn't know where he was. His mind, accustomed to waking up in his king-size bed with cool silk sheets, took a few seconds to process the weight on his legs. He looked down, and his heart sank. Martina and Lucia were fast asleep, tangled in a wool blanket, their heads resting on his thighs. On the other side, on a makeshift mattress on the floor, Valentina was asleep with one hand outstretched toward him, and Sophia and Elena were huddled against his back. It was the image of a beautiful shipwreck. They were survivors. Santiago moved with millimeter care so as not to wake them, gently freeing himself from the weight of his daughters. He stood up, feeling the creaking of his joints and the dull ache from the blows of the previous night. He needed coffee, he needed to think, but above all, he needed to understand. He shuffled toward the kitchen. As the coffee brewed, filling the air with its bitter, familiar aroma, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Valentina. She was wearing a giant gray wool sweater that belonged to Santiago, which reached almost to her knees, and she was barefoot. She looked small, fragile, but her eyes had a disarming clarity. "Good morning, sir," she whispered, hugging herself against the morning chill. "Santiago," he corrected, pouring 2 cups. "After last night, I think 'sir' is unnecessary." He held out the steaming cup. "Here, take it." Valentina took it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her bruised fingers. There was a comfortable silence, something that had never existed between them before. Santiago leaned against the marble kitchen island, watching the steam rise from his coffee. "I have to ask you something, Valentina," he said finally, without looking her in the eye, fearing her answer. "Because of all the places on the ranch, of all the safe play areas I built, of the parks imported from Germany that I installed in the North Garden, why did you take them to that dirty old place?" Valentina blew on her coffee before answering. She knew that the question was not a reproach, but a genuine need to understand the chasm that had existed between him and his daughters. "I wasn't the one who chose the place, Santiago," she said softly. "It was them." Santiago looked up, confused. They don't speak, or didn't speak until last night." "Children don't need words to tell you where their heart is," Valentina interrupted. "The first day I arrived, I took them for a walk. They were stiff, scared. We walked past the new swings and they didn't even look at them. But when we passed near the old barn where the chickens are, they stopped." Sophia began to cry, but it wasn't a cry of sadness. She approached the fence and put her little face against the old wood. Valentina put the cup down on the table and put her hand in the pocket of her enormous sweater. "I found this yesterday, before you arrived. It was hiding in a high beam of the chicken coop covered in dust. I think that's why the girls wanted to go there. They knew it was there. They felt it." Valentina took out a yellowish envelope, stained by time and humidity. The paper was wrinkled as if it had been read and folded 1,000 times. Santiago felt like his breath was being cut short. He would recognize that handwriting anywhere in the universe. It was Elena's handwriting, his late wife. "What is this?" he asked in a trembling voice, holding the envelope as if it were made of glass. "Read it," Valentina said. "I believe she left instructions that you never received." Santiago opened the envelope with clumsy fingers. Inside was a sheet of notebook paper, hastily torn out, written on with blue ink. The date was 2 weeks before the accident. To my dear Santiago, if you find this, it's probably because I'm in the garden and you're in your office, worried about the future, about the stock market, about that empire you're building for us. I love you for that, my love. I love you for wanting to give us the world. But I'm scared. I'm afraid that in your eagerness to protect them, you'll forget that they are children. Yesterday I heard you scolding Sophia for getting ice cream on her dress. I saw your face of anguish, not because of the dress, but because the mess scares you. Do you believe that order is security? But chaos is also life. Santiago, this chicken coop, this old and ugly place that you always say you're going to demolish to build a tennis court, is my refuge. I come here with the girls when you travel. We get dirty here. Here we chase chickens and pretend we are explorers. Here Sophia laughs so hard that milk comes out of her nose. Here Martina learned to walk by chasing a chick. I'm leaving this note here in my happy place as a reminder for the future. If something happens to me or if the world simply hardens us too much, don't take the mud away from them, Santiago. Don't take away their land. Promise me you'll let them have dirty feet and happy hearts. The cleanliness washes away with water, but the memories of a perfect childhood remain forever. Your messy wife, Elena, loves you. Santiago read the letter once and then again. The letters danced before his eyes, blurred by the tears that fell freely onto the paper, mixing with the old ink. He slumped into one of the kitchen chairs, covering his face with his hands, bang with a force that shook his shoulders. All this time, all this damn time, he had been fighting against the memory of his wife, trying to honor her, keeping everything perfect, spotless, just as he believed she deserved. He had turned his house into a sterile mausoleum, and in doing so had been erasing the true essence of the woman he loved. She didn't want porcelain princesses. She wanted girls with scraped knees and dirty hands. I forbade them from going there, Santiago stammered between sobs, speaking to the ghost of his wife through Valentina. I forbade them from going to the only place where they felt her close. I took their mother away from them twice, once when she died and once when I erased her traces. He felt a warm hand on his shoulder. Valentina stood by his side, steadfast, without judging him. You didn't know that, Santiago, she said sweetly. Pain blinds us. You only wanted to protect them from pain and thought that by shielding your world you would achieve that. It's what any scared parent would do, but now you know. Now you have the letter. Santiago raised his head, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at Valentina and saw for the first time not an employee, but a colleague, someone who had understood his family better than he did himself in a matter of weeks. How did you know? He asked. How did you know they needed this? Because I also lost my mother when I was a child, Valentina confessed with a sad smile. And I would give everything I have, which isn't much, to have a memory of us cooking and making a mess in the kitchen again, instead of remembering her in a clean and quiet hospital. Santiago nodded slowly, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. He stood up, putting the letter in his breast pocket, close to his heart as if it were a shield. Thank you, he said with deep sincerity. Thank you for returning them and her to me. At that moment, giggles were heard coming from the room. The girls had woken up. The sound that was once strange and foreign in that house now seemed like the most natural music in the world. Santiago took a deep breath. The air in the kitchen smelled of coffee and hope. I have to make a call, Santiago said with a new determination in his voice. A firmness that no longer came from fear, but from purpose. I have to cancel some things and I have to organize, or rather, unorganize some others. Valentina smiled, and for the first time in that house, Santiago Navarrete smiled back. Not the shark-like smile of business, but a human smile, tired but real. The wall had fallen. The radical change. 2 days later, the sun shone with insolent intensity over the Navarrete ranch. The storm had left the sky a deep, clear blue, and the earth, although still damp, was beginning to dry under the midday heat. But the peace of the countryside was abruptly interrupted by the roar of high-displacement engines. A convoy of 3 shiny, armored black SUVs crossed through the now open main gate and advanced along the gravel road, raising dust and authority. They were the partners. Mr. Moretti, a 60-year-old man with a bulldog face and suits that cost more than the average house, got out of the first vehicle. He was followed by a group of executives, lawyers, and advisors, all dressed in gray and black, with leather briefcases and expressions of impatience. They had a meeting scheduled with Santiago months ago to finalize the merger of the shipping company, a $500 million deal. "We arrived 10 minutes late," Moretti grumbled, looking at his gold watch. "Santiago hates delays. He'll surely be furious. Prepare the apologies and the contracts." The group walked toward the mansion's main entrance, expecting to find the butler at the door, the air conditioning set to 18 degrees Celsius, and Santiago sitting at the head of the conference table, impatient and immaculate. But the front door was closed. There was no one waiting. "How strange," murmured one of the lawyers. "Has the location changed?" Moretti, frowning, circled the house toward the back terrace, followed by his entourage in gray suits. What they found upon reaching the back garden left them rooted to the spot, mouths agape in utter disbelief. There was no conference table, no projection charts, no air conditioning. What there was a picnic on the lawn that Santiago usually kept laser cut and where stepping was forbidden. There were brightly colored blankets spread out, open picnic baskets, toys scattered everywhere, and chickens. Chickens roaming freely around the mansion's garden, pecking among the executives' shoes. And in the middle of all that pastoral chaos was Santiago Navarrete, but not the Santiago they knew. He wasn't wearing a tie. In fact, he wasn't even wearing a jacket. He was dressed in faded jeans and a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was barefoot, and he was laughing. Santiago was lying on his back on the grass with Martina and Lucia sitting on him, tickling him. Sophia was placing a crooked flower crown on his head, and Elena was running around with Valentina, who was wearing a simple summer dress and laughing as freely as the little girls. The scene was so shocking to the corporate world that Moretti had to clear his throat 3 times before his voice came out. "Santiago," he asked in a tone that mixed horror and confusion. "What the hell is this?" The laughter stopped. Santiago propped himself up on his elbows, the flower crown tilted on his sweaty forehead. Seeing the men in suits standing there like crows in a spring field, he didn't get up immediately. He didn't brush off the grass in embarrassment. He simply smiled. "Moretti," Santiago said with startling calmness, "you arrived early, or maybe I lost track of time. The sun is lovely today, don't you think?" "The sun?" Moretti looked around, ignoring the question, watching a hen peck at his patent leather shoe. "Santiago, the merger agreement needs to be signed in 20 minutes. The investors in Tokyo are waiting for the video call." "What are you doing like that? And who are these people? Why are there farm animals in the front garden?" The executives looked at Valentina with disdain, assuming she was part of the staff, that she had overstepped her bounds. Valentina, feeling the weight of those stares, made a move to get up and take the girls away. But Santiago gently took her hand, indicating that she should stay. Santiago stood slowly, brushing the bits of grass from his trousers, but without losing that newfound aura of calm. He walked toward Moretti, and for the first time, the millionaire seemed larger, more imposing barefoot and disheveled than in his suits of armor. "These people, Moretti, are my family," Santiago said, gesturing to the girls and Valentina. "And what I'm doing is living something I forgot to put on my agenda for the last 5 years." "Santiago, please," huffed the lawyer, opening his briefcase. "I understand you need to relax, but there's $500 million at stake. We can't play games now. We need your signature. You need to go change and make yourself presentable." Santiago glanced at the contract the lawyer handed him. Then he looked at Sophia, who was watching him with wide eyes, waiting to see if Daddy, the ice giant, would return. He looked at Valentina, who was holding Elena in her arms. "No," Santiago said. The word landed like a stone dropped into a pond. "What do you mean, no?" Moretti asked, astonished. "I'm not signing today, and I'm not changing. In fact, I like how I look. My daughters say I look soft." "You've lost your mind," Moretti exploded, losing his patience. "If we don't sign today, the penalty will be in the millions. You're throwing your reputation away to play with chickens and nannies." Santiago closed the distance with Moretti. His gaze hardened for a second, reminiscent of the business shark, but this time the bite was different. Listen to me carefully, Luis, he said, using the lawyer's first name, something he never did. For years, my reputation was that of a man who never failed, who was always impeccable, who made money while he slept. And while I was doing that, my daughters forgot how to speak, and I forgot how to feel. I almost lost them 2 nights ago. I almost lost the only thing that truly matters because I was too busy making sure nothing got dirty. Santiago took the contract from the lawyer's hands, looked at it for a second, and then, with a calm motion, dropped it onto the picnic table, right next to a plate of watermelon rinds. Money comes and goes, Moretti, but my daughter's childhood is slipping away right now, second by second, and I'm not going to miss another minute of it for a meeting with Tokyo. Are you canceling the deal? The pale lawyer asked. I'm postponing it, Santiago corrected. Tell the Japanese I had a life-threatening family emergency. We're looking for eggs in the garden, and I think I saw one near the oak tree. If they want to do business with me, they'll have to wait until I'm done being a father. And if they don't like it, well, there are other shipping companies out there. He turned to the executives who were staring at him as if he'd grown a second head. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flying lesson to catch up on. Valentina says that if you run fast enough with your arms outstretched, you can almost take off. And I believe her. Santiago, this is career suicide, Moretti warned. No, Luis, this is a rebirth. Santiago turned his back on them. He didn't wait to see their reactions. He walked back to where Valentina and the girls were waiting for him. Daddy, look, Sophia shouted. Yes, he shouted, pointing at a butterfly fluttering by. Coming, princess, he replied, taking off running. Moretti and his entourage stood there in the sun, watching one of the richest men on the continent run barefoot across the grass, chasing a butterfly, his laughter mingling with that of 4 little girls and a woman in a floral dress. The executives exchanged glances. They were uncomfortable in their hot, tight suits. For a brief, fleeting moment, as they watched the scene, one of them felt a strange pang in his chest. It wasn't contempt, it wasn't pity, it was envy. Pure and simple envy at seeing a man surrounded by millions who had finally found something worth more than all the gold in the world. Santiago Navarrete had lost a contract that afternoon, but he had gained a life. And as he took Valentina's hand and lifted Martina onto his shoulders, he knew it was the best deal he had ever made. The happy ending, conclusion. Time, that silent judge that Santiago used to measure in fiscal quarters and profit margins, was now measured in something entirely different. In inches of height his daughters had gained, and in the number of drawings covering the stainless steel refrigerator in the kitchen. 6 months had passed, 6 months since the great storm, as they now called it on the ranch, an event that had divided the Navarrete family's history into a gray before and a technicolor after. It was Saturday morning. The spring sun streamed through the living room windows, but it no longer illuminated a museum-like room where untouchable Ming vases once stood. Now there was a fortress built from sofa cushions. Where there had once been silence, now music played. Valentina had put on an old salsa record at a moderate volume, and the tropical rhythm filled the corners that had previously only known the echo of solitary footsteps. Santiago came downstairs. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore worn jeans, stained with green paint, and a white t-shirt that revealed arms more toned not from the gym, but from carrying girls and building treehouses. Dad, look! The shout came from the kitchen. It was Lucia. Santiago smiled, a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in an expression of genuine happiness. He entered the kitchen, and the scene he found would have given the Santiago of a year ago a heart attack. The kitchen was a battlefield of flour and sugar. Valentina was in the center, her face covered in white, trying to knead a mountain of cookie dough, while Martina and Elena threw handfuls of flour into the air as if it were snow. Sophia, sitting on the counter, something strictly forbidden in the old regime, decorated already baked cookies with surgical concentration using brightly colored icing. Good morning, my disastrous bakers, Santiago greeted, dodging a cloud of flour. Dad! The 4 girls ran towards him. There was no more fear. There were no more doubts. They threw themselves at his legs with the force of a tsunami of love. Santiago bent down and embraced the girls, inhaling the scent of vanilla and oatmeal soap. Look, we made you a special cookie, Sophia said, holding out a misshapen mass with blue icing. He's a shark because you're the king shark, but one of the good ones. Santiago took the cookie as if it were a sacred relic. He took an exaggerated bite, making faces of pleasure that made the four girls burst out laughing. Delicious. Tastes like victory. Valentina wiped her hands on a rag and approached him. She no longer wore the blue uniform with the white apron. She wore a light dress with yellow flowers, simple and beautiful, which highlighted the light of her skin. Her hair, previously always tied up in a severe bun, as required by protocol, now fell loose over her shoulders. Free. I saved you some coffee, she said in that soft voice that had become the soundtrack of Santiago's piece. Thank you, he replied, taking the cup, but without taking his eyes off her. Good morning. With 4 human alarm clocks jumping on my bed at 6 a.m., she laughed, the dynamic has changed organically. Valentina had not accepted simply living there without doing anything. Santiago had insisted on paying for her university studies. She was studying pedagogy online, applying everything she learned with the girls, and in the evening she ran the house not as an employee, but as the de facto matriarch that fate had placed in his path. I have a surprise, Santiago announced, putting down the cup. Get dressed, we're going out. Where to? Elena asked, her eyes wide. To the place where it all began. The ride in the pickup truck, now filled with car seats and cookie crumbs in the back seat, was short. Santiago drove to the western edge of the property, near the creek, but didn't stop at the crash site. He continued a little farther to a raised clearing overlooking the entire valley. There, in the shade of a centuries-old oak tree, stood a new structure. It wasn't a tennis court, it wasn't a helipad, it was a park, but not an imported plastic and metal park. It was an adventure park made of wood, rope, and tires. There was a giant tree house, a suspension bridge, and most importantly, an area specifically designated as the mud pit, with a hand-painted sign that read, "No clean entry." Wow, the girls shouted in unison. It's for you, Santiago said, turning off the engine. So you never forget that getting dirty is part of growing up. The girls didn't wait for any further instructions. They opened the doors and rushed out towards the games. Santiago and Valentina stayed behind, watching them run. The wind stirred the tall grass, and the sound of the stream, which had once been a deadly threat, was now a soothing background murmur. Santiago turned toward Valentina. His face turned serious for a moment, but it was a seriousness charged with emotion. Valentina, he said, taking her hands. She turned around, surprised by the change in tone. What's happening? Don't you like how the swing turned out? The swing is perfect. My life is what it wasn't until you came along. Santiago took a deep breath. He had negotiated company mergers with the toughest men in the world without breaking a sweat. But now, in front of this woman, who had arrived at his house with an old suitcase and a giant heart, his knees trembled. I've spent the last few months trying to make it up to you for how I treated you at the beginning, trying to be the father they deserve. But I've realized something. I can't do it alone. I don't want to do it alone. And I don't want you here just because they need you. Valentina stared at him, her dark eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. Santiago, I want you to be here because I need you, he confessed, finally letting out the words he had kept bottled up in his throat for weeks. I need you when I wake up. I need you when the day is bad. I need you to laugh at my failed attempts at cooking. I love you, Valentina. I fell in love with you the moment I saw you jump into that river. But I love you more every day I see you teaching my daughters to be free. Santiago put his hand in his pocket. He didn't pull out a giant, ostentatious Tiffany diamond ring. He came up with something much more significant. It was a simple silver chain with a small feather-shaped pendant hanging from it. A bird's feather. I know you don't like expensive jewelry, he said, fastening the chain around her neck. This is to remind you that you taught us all how to fly. Valentina touched the coal pendant against her skin, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a hard life that had finally found a safe harbor. I love you too, Santiago, she whispered. I loved you from the moment I saw that beneath that icy exterior was a man willing to wear his shoes out for his daughters. Santiago didn't wait any longer. He took her by the waist and kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss under the midday sunlight, sealing a pact that needed no lawyers or signatures. A family pact. In the distance, the girls stopped playing. Seeing their father kissing Mama V, they began to clap and shout. Kiss, 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 they chanted, jumping in the mud pit. Santiago and Valentina separated, laughing, their foreheads touching. I think we have a hearing, he said. I think we have a family, she corrected. That afternoon, Ramirez, the head of security, made his usual rounds, but instead of patrolling the perimeter with a gun and a stern face, he carried a bag of marshmallows. He approached the bonfire that Santiago had lit in the backyard. Night had fallen, and the stars shone with a clarity seen only in the countryside. Around the fire, the scene was the very definition of wealth. There was no champagne or caviar, just hot chocolate in mismatched cups. Santiago sat on a log with Sofia and Elena asleep in his lap, exhausted from playing. Valentina was beside him, roasting marshmallows with Lucia and Martina, showing them how to get them golden brown, not burnt. Sir, Ramirez said, approaching respectfully but with a relaxed smile. Attorney Moretti called again. He's asking when he can reschedule the meeting with the Japanese despised. Santiago didn't even look up from the fire. He gently stroked Sofia's hair. Tell him I'm busy, Ramirez. Busy, sir? Ramirez surveyed the placid scene. Yes, tell him I'm investing in my most valuable asset. Santiago glanced at Valentina, who winked at him from across the fire. And that the returns are endless. Tell him to call next month or next year. Understood. Mr. Ramirez nodded, visibly pleased, and retreated into the darkness, leaving the family in their bubble of light. Santiago looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of his dead wife's absence. He felt her presence, yes, but not as a painful ghost, but as a silent blessing. He could almost hear her whispering in the wind. You did well, Santiago. You finally understood, she seemed to say. He looked at his hands. There was dirt under his fingernails. His clothes smelled of wood smoke. He was physically tired, more so than he had ever been in his office life, and yet he felt lighter than a feather. Valentina leaned against his shoulder, passing him a sticky marshmallow. What are you thinking about, Shari asked. Santiago took the treat, savoring the burnt sugar, and looked at his 4 daughters, safe, sound, dirty, and deeply loved. I'm thinking about how I was the poorest man in the world with millions in the bank, he replied, putting his free arm around her. And now I am the king of the universe, and all I needed was a little mud and a lot of love. The fire crackled, sending small orange embers up at the stars. In the distance, a rooster crowed at an ungodly hour, confused by the moonlight, and one of the girls laughed in her sleep. The story of the ice millionaire had ended. The story of the Navarrete family was just beginning.